Leilani, it's very good to have you with us, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about the work you're doing in Canada and the changes that have happened as a result of the housing as a human right being part of your legislation. But could you start by telling us a bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. And it's really nice to be here in conversation with you, Sheila. So thanks for inviting me. So I'm Leilani. I am probably now best known for two things. I was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to housing from 2014 to 2020. A lot of people don't know what that role is. I like to call it a kind of global watchdog role, and with sort of two foci looking at how people are experiencing housing at the domestic local level and what are governments doing? Are they actually meeting their international human rights obligations? So, in that way, a global watchdog. The other thing I think people know me for is that I appeared in a documentary about what we call the financialization of housing, which is where housing is used as really a vehicle or an instrument of investment, a commodity, rather than where housing is viewed as home and a human right. And that film is called Push. And so a lot of people know me from there. I'm currently the global director of a relatively new entity called The Shift, which is really focused on securing the human right to housing for people around the world and trying to get governments, private actors, and even the nonprofit sector to understand that we really need to shift the narrative, shift away again from understanding housing as a commodity and back toward an understanding as home, a place of well-being where families can grow and where people can contribute to their communities.
That sounds really exciting work.
It's great work. I have to say, I'm pretty lucky. I wake up every morning thinking, okay, let's go.
Now, I know that Canada has adopted housing as a human right. Which other countries have adopted that as part of their legislation so far?
Yeah. So, I mean, constitutions around the world, over 80 constitutions around the world include the right to housing. So Canada's actually doesn't have it in its constitution, but we do have legislation that recognizes housing as a human right, which I'll talk about in 1 second, but only to say that, you know, it is in many European constitutions, for example, Finland, Sweden, Portugal. So France, I mean, it's in many constitutions, in Eastern Europe as well. And emerging countries, as they often go through constitutional reform, they will include the right to housing there. The difficulty comes in terms of implementation. Many constitutions require legislation that actually implements the constitutional right, depending on the legal regime that you fall under. And other political structures require the sort of internalization of international law for the right to become meaningful, et cetera, et cetera. But it is very prominently in constitutions around the world. In the case of Canada, it's not in our constitution, and constitutional reform was not an option. It's just not an option. It's a very difficult thing to reform a constitution. The last time it was reformed was in 1982. The father of our current prime minister was the one who opened up the Constitution. And this prime minister, the son of Pierre Trudeau, so Justin Trudeau, is not going to go near opening up the Constitution. No way. And certainly for a whole variety of reasons, familial and political. However, the government was under a lot of pressure. I was UN rapporteur while this was happening. And of course, I live in Canada. I'm in the nation's capital in Ottawa. But there were many groups on the ground really pushing for a legislative right to housing, for us to see it somewhere in legislation. It's a very interesting story, Sheila, and one that should resonate with UK audiences because Canada had been quite aligned with governments like the UK and Australia that internationally were really pushing against recognizing housing as a human right. So the UK, Canada, Australia, the United States would go to international fora, still do, not Canada though, but saying, really pushing against the idea that housing is a human right, a freestanding human right. They'll say that it's not justiciable. That means you can't go to court with it. They'll only recognize non-discrimination elements of housing rather than the more holistic, fulsome understanding of housing as a human right. And so Canada broke ranks with their peers in adopting this legislation. And the legislation says now that it is the government of Canada's housing policy to recognize that housing is a fundamental human right as it's understood in international human rights law. So it's been an amazing step for this country to take. And to be honest, it happened fairly quickly. The law's been in place now for 2 years. And I would say it took about 2 years of hard lobbying and a rapporteur really pushing to make it happen. But that's pretty quick progress.
Right, and so there aren't other countries that have put it in their legislation, just Canada.
Oh, no, there are other countries that have put it in their legislation as well. So, Portugal recently, for example, has adopted a housing law that recognizes the right to housing. We're starting to see city governments, which is a very important piece in this. City governments are starting to write their own charters. For example, the city of Toronto, I happen to have had a small hand in that, has a city charter that recognizes the right to housing. So no, that it's not an uncommon move. Wales, for example, doesn't have the legislation yet, but they're working very hard in Wales to see legislation that recognizes the right to housing be adopted. And they've drafted, community groups have drafted draft legislation. The government has been the government in Wales has been pretty open to the idea of housing as a human right. So even within one of the UK nations, you're seeing some really important progress. Scotland as well.
At Labour Party conference this year, we passed a resolution which would have that effect if when a Labour government is returned. So we're on our way.
I think that's wonderful. And, you know, people ask me often, Sheila, um, is legislation necessary for the realization of the right to housing? And my answer is this: it is necessary. And no, it's not sufficient. So, of course, legislation is never sufficient. We all know that in any area. Legislation, though, is the vehicle through which good policies and programs can evolve and emerge. And so you need that the ground to be the you need to lay the groundwork through legislation. And it's really important from the point of view of visibility. It makes people who are struggling with the right to housing, who don't enjoy the right to housing, it makes them feel visible when they're often invisible.
I wanted to ask you what impact it has had in Canada so far.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I track these sorts of things, and I'm going to be honest to say, on some levels, I feel like, oh, it hasn't made enough of a difference. And I say that because there remains a disconnect between that legislation and the way in which our decision makers and policymakers think. But you have to realize these are early days. The legislation is 2 years old. The decision makers haven't had intense training or dealings with the right to housing. They don't have a deep understanding of the implications the right to housing has for example, resource allocation. They don't know, they're not connecting with the Ministry of Finance to say, Ministry of Finance, when you allocate our ministry budgets for housing and to address homelessness, you have to realize that we're now dealing with housing as a human right, and it might mean something different in terms of how much is allocated. The period of time over which money is allocated might change. For example, the emphasis of dollars might change. There might be conditionality attached to dollars that are given to different levels of government. We're a federal state in Canada. So, um, that percolation, that kind of embeddedness hasn't yet happened, unfortunately. That being said, we've just had a general election in Canada, and it was fascinating to see how the political parties came out in the area of housing. First of all, there was recognition that we have a housing crisis in this country. And I attribute that not just to the fact that we have a housing crisis in this country, because we've had a housing crisis for many years. We had an election 2 years ago. There was an acute housing crisis at that time. It was not an election issue. But this time around, it was. And I think that's in part because of all of the noise that got made from the ground up to have this legislation enacted, right? So housing became a topic of conversation across the country. And so it would have been very hard for the political parties to ignore, I think. And I think the legislation played a role in that. I also noticed in all of the party platforms, almost, not all, an emphasis on addressing homelessness, not enough emphasis and not due emphasis if you understand housing as a human right, because homelessness is a prima facie violation of the right to housing. Obviously, how could it not be? And so governments and political parties need to understand that addressing homelessness is an urgent and priority matter under human rights, period. And so that should have been a bigger plank in all of the platforms, but it was in the platform. So that was good to see. I also saw in the platforms attention to foreign investment and investment in housing and the impact that's having on affordability in this country, particularly for rental accommodation, but also for home ownership. In fact, the political parties were more concerned with the impact it was having on home ownership, which again shows they don't quite get the right to housing. But the fact that they've started to identify this financialization of housing is also suggestive to me that they're starting to understand that they, as government, have a role in controlling the housing market a little bit. And that is more aligned with a human rights approach than the free market neoliberal approach, which is let's just let it all happen and let's see and let's hope that low income people can manage to pay the rent. There was a real turnaround on that front. And I say that that's sort of consistent with a human rights approach. So I think it's starting to have an effect. Certainly, it's very common now to hear the terminology housing as a human right in Canada. And that is certainly new in the last few years.
Right. And you've talked a bit about homelessness, and you talked about home ownership and housing finances. What else do you hope it will? What's at the top of your list for it to have an impact on in Canada?
Yeah. Like, you mean, where should the human right to housing sort of attach itself in an important way? Yeah.
Yeah.
So obviously, yes, of course, homelessness. And it might surprise folks in the UK to know that Canada has a significant homelessness problem. We have more than 235,000 people living in homelessness in any given year. We're a small country. Recall, our population isn't even 40 million. So that's sizable and probably disproportionate to our size as a nation. What you wouldn't know also is that we have a lot of rough sleepers living in parks, in tents, in cities across the country, big and small cities. And in a temperate climate, that might be okay. We have temperatures that go below 20 degrees Celsius in the winter. So you can imagine that that's not viable. We have shelters that are oversubscribed, always at 95 capacity. COVID has changed that, of course, because of distancing rules, and because they're unsafe settings for people, because COVID spreads in congregate settings. So that is top priority, and the right to housing addresses that naturally. Next on my list, and I think human rights demands this, is better tenant protections. Because if homelessness is a prima facie violation, what you need to do as a nation then is prevent homelessness. Yeah, that's obvious. And so how do you prevent homelessness? Well, one way is through better tenant protections. So what does that look like? Well, human rights isn't prescriptive. So it doesn't say, well, you must do A, B, and C. Every jurisdiction is going to have its own cultural peculiarities and political peculiarities and legal peculiarities. So it's not prescriptive, but we do know, for example, evictions, even if they're legal evictions due to arrears, for example, non-payment of rent, those that result in homelessness are in fact inconsistent with human rights and a violation of the right to housing. And that's for obvious reasons, because as I already said, homelessness is a prima facie violation. And so you need tenant protection such that it's not to say a landlord cannot evict someone. If someone is not paying the rent, the landlord can evict, but you need to have a social safety net there to make sure that that person doesn't land in homelessness. And shelters do not cut it. So that's not the rebound answer. I've seen, for example, in Spain, they had a system in Barcelona, I believe it's still functioning, where when a tenant is being evicted for arrears and goes to the tribunal or the adjudicative body that deals with that, there is a social worker there assigned to the person, and the eviction cannot go through until that person has secured alternative accommodation. And the social worker works with all the social agencies to make sure that person doesn't fall through. Now, I understand it wasn't working perfectly, but it's an interesting idea. And in the UK, I think you're very good at when you do things, you can be very good at it if you decide. I mean, the UK was known for doing social housing well in yesteryear, many, many, many years, pre-Thatcher years. So if the UK decided to set its mind at doing this and ensuring people just don't fall through the cracks, and land in homelessness, I think you could do it successfully. Other tenant protections, rent controls are really important. Rent freezes, I think, can be appropriate depending on the circumstances. If you take a big economic recession like the one we might be in now because of the pandemic, people are underemployed, unemployed. So those are important measures. There are other measures that we don't talk about enough, and I think are really relevant in the UK, which is ensuring that social assistance rates or universal credit are set at levels, or housing allowances are set at levels that are meaningful, that respond to market realities or respond to the realities of what's available in terms of housing. You can't in our country, my country in Canada, we have this problem. We have social assistance rates set at 50% below poverty levels. Well, no one can live in receipt of social assistance and afford a one-bedroom apartment or even a studio apartment. It's impossible. So those are things that human rights attach to and look at and try to remedy.
The other thing I was wondering about was whether it could have an impact on the number of empty properties there are
Ah,
in any country.
such a good question. Vacant properties, which is a huge problem in the city of London, for example. Um, It sure can. So I don't want to get too technical, but there is this idea. It's not an idea; it's a standard under international human rights law, and it says that governments must spend the maximum of available resources to ensure access to economic, social, and cultural rights, and the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to housing. And so I would say that vacant homes are a resource that governments haven't maximized. There's different ways to treat that. Some governments are taxing vacant homes at a high rate, and there's a twofold effect, ostensibly. One effect should be dissuasion of leaving homes empty, because if you set the tax high enough, it should dissuade people from leaving properties vacant. That's what they try to do in uh, Vancouver, for example. But they've only set it at, I think it's a 1%. So it's not actually um, having that dissuasive impact, I don't think. But the other impact it can have is if you target that tax that's raised back into affordable housing, you can then generate money for a city, for example, to have, money to invest in affordable housing. Um, I'm not a big proponent of, I'm not saying that that's bad to tax vacant homes. I think that should be a given, that you tax vacant homes at a higher rate, because they're not productive in any way, shape, or form. If no one's living there, you don't even get the productive value of in the economy of someone living in a home and then going to the local shop, right? Or going to the hairdresser or going to the pub. So you're losing that kind of active input into the economy. But it also is just sitting there vacant, doing nothing, providing nothing to. It has no social good. It's playing no social good. So you could put restrictions on vacant homes. You could just make it such that they cannot be, you cannot have a vacant home, that you have to show residency. You could be pretty heavy handed. I don't think the UK government is certainly not the current government would ever do this, but you could go down the expropriation road. Um, I don't know the powers of the city of London, but Barcelona and Lisbon have taken an expropriation approach in different ways. So Lisbon has used a carrot and said during the pandemic, all the vacant homes, because they have an Airbnb, a plethora of Airbnb units, short-term lets, not just Airbnb in Portugal. There's other companies active there, other platforms. So they've said they've tried to entice the owners to give up their properties on a lease basis and rent them out to key workers, for example, who are in need, especially during the pandemic, right? Because of the need for so many key workers. In Barcelona, they've taken more of a stick approach, which is you're going to leave this unit vacant for more than 12 months. Well, we will expropriate it and we will lease it for a certain period of time, and you will not have access to that unit, and we will make it affordable housing for key workers and others. So those are interesting approaches, and I applaud those efforts, because the problem that's happened is it's been allowed to occur in London. I've seen maps of London with all these red dots of all of the different vacant homes and investor driven homes in London, and it's outrageous.
I was going to ask you what you thought we would gain most in the UK from adopting this, right? But you actually have covered quite a lot of those points already.
Yeah. I'll just add one thing, Sheila. I was thinking about this yesterday, as a matter of fact, because I was speaking to some people in Wales, and they did this really lovely. So in Wales, I mentioned they have this draft legislation on the go on the right to housing, and um, they did a kind of little piece on what might have happened in the Grenfell tragedy if the right to housing had been in place. And I think it's a really good exercise, to take something as tragic and as um, unnecessary as what happened in Grenfell and examine it from a right to housing point of view. And what I'd like to say at the outset, and I intimated this earlier in my comments to you, is by enacting legislation that recognizes the human right to housing, governments make visible the invisible, and it is a big nod to people who are not experiencing and enjoying the right to housing, to say, we recognize you are out there. We, government, recognize that there are people out there who really need the right to housing to be realized. And if you talk to anyone who survived Grenfell and the neighbors around Grenfell, but particularly the survivors of Grenfell, what you hear, and I've done this, is that they were raising alarm bells way before the fire at their tenant meetings. They were bringing it to council, and this has come out through the inquiry, of course, and no one was listening to them. And we know that there is a thing called state capture, that investors, private equity firms, land developers, property developers, real estate sector individuals, business people, they have what we call state capture. In other words, they have the ear of government, they influence government, they actually can often, in a neoliberal state, dictate what government policy is. A low income person struggling who lives in Grenfell has no political power and is not listened to. And human rights enable that. It's so strong. It's so important. When we passed the legislation in Canada, at the time, I was not just the rapporteur. I was also the executive director of an organization called Canada Without Poverty. And my board of directors, made up of people living in poverty, called me. The chair of the board called me, and she was crying when the legislation had passed. And she said, I feel so validated. It was a real moment for me. I'll never forget it. That a piece of legislation, which people think of as crusty or boring and, eggheady, and, that it had moved her as an individual who had been struggling to be heard. I mean, she was the chair of this, Canada Without Poverty, an advocacy organization. And it was very meaningful for her. So I would emphasize that role that legislation can play. Of course, it should affect, if it's good legislation, it should affect all policy, legislation, and programming that has an impact on housing. Everything should be funneled through the human rights framework. And so, whether it's a policy happening over there in your Ministry of Finance or Treasury, or whether it's happening right within the ministry responsible for housing and homelessness, it should all be funneled through this human rights lens, framework, sieve, whatever you want to call it, so that every decision taken that touches on housing should promote the right to housing, should move the right to housing forward.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really good note to finish on, because I think that shows the all encompassing effect that it could have. And
That's right.
I hope that's where we're going in this country as well.
I
Thank
hope so
you.
too. It's a pleasure, Sheila. Thank you.